Ah, very well. Settle in then. Let the world outside fade away, and let us journey back, not just to Middle-earth, but into the very heart of what makes a story truly matter. There are some evenings, even now, when the world outside grows quiet and the only light comes from the hearth, that I find myself transported, not in some fanciful, actually way, but in a manner that feels more akin to a memory, a genuine echo from a life lived elsewhere. I can almost feel the familiar weight of the grey robes on my shoulders, the solid, gnarled grain of the staff in my hand, its wood worn smooth by a grip that held it through shadow and fire. It is in these moments that I think of Gandalf, not as a character I played, but as a presence, a consciousness I was privileged to borrow for a time. And in the quiet, I often find my thoughts drifting back to the very soul of the story we all tried to tell. The quiet, beating heart of Professor Tolkien's magnificent creation. It is a single, simple truth, a truth so profound yet so easily overlooked that it functions as the master key to the entire saga, a truth that I believe is more vital now in your world than it ever was. And it is this: even the smallest person can change the course of the future. Now, let that sentiment settle for a moment. Do not mistake it for a mere platitude, a comforting phrase to be embroidered on a sampler. It is, I contend, one of the most revolutionary and fundamentally hopeful statements in the grand sweep of epic literature. For centuries, our great stories, the very myths that shape our understanding of heroism, have been about the great. They are the chronicles of the mighty, the chosen, the divinely appointed. Think of the clang of Hector's bronze armor on the plains of Troy, the cunning of Odysseus outwitting gods and monsters, the raw, sinewy strength of Beowulf wrestling a fiend from the depths. These are tales of demigods and kings, of warriors whose fates are intertwined with the fates of nations. Their shoulders are broad enough to carry the world. And when they clash, the heavens themselves seem to tremble. And into this grand tradition, this pantheon of the powerful, walks a quiet Oxford professor, a man who had seen the horrors of the Somme, who had witnessed firsthand how the grand designs of great men could lead to fields of mud and pointless death. And he dares to write an epic that turns this entire tradition on its head. He chooses to place the ultimate burden, the hinge upon which the fate of his entire world will swing, not in the hands of a king in his castle, nor an elf queen in her timeless forest, and certainly not a wizard with cosmic power at his command. He places it with breathtaking audacity into the small, soft hands of a hobbit. A hobbit, let us truly consider what that means. To the grand players of Middle-earth, a hobbit is a rustic joke, a quaint anomaly. They are a gentle, peace-loving folk, so profoundly unimportant on the world stage that most have forgotten they even exist. Their entire culture is a celebration of the small, the tangible, the immediate. Their triumphs are not of the battlefield, but of the garden, a prize-winning pumpkin, a perfectly brewed ale. Their history is not written in blood and steel, but in family trees and recipes passed down through generations. Their world is one of well-tilled soil, of smoke rings drifting on a summer's evening, of the deep, abiding comfort of a round-doored home burrowed into the earth. They are, by their very nature, profoundly and wonderfully ordinary. Their greatest fear is an adventure. Their greatest desire, a life so peaceful and predictable it is not worth the telling. They are the antithesis of the epic hero. They are us. They are the common folk, the quiet majority who simply wish to live their lives in peace, far from the machinations of the powerful. And that, you see, is precisely their strength. That is their secret weapon. Gandalf, in his long and weary wisdom, understood this better than anyone. Where the proud and the mighty saw only weakness, a race of childlike creatures obsessed with food and comfort, he saw a unique and potent resilience. He saw a moral bedrock, a fundamental goodness that was as sturdy and unyielding as the ancient hills they lived in. Sauron, the great enemy, the Dark Lord of Mordor, was the ultimate expression of power and will. His gaze, amplified by the Palantir, was a sweeping, terrible searchlight that scoured Middle-earth for any threat to his dominion. It sought the glint of armies on the march, the smoke from forges hammering out new swords, the whispered plots in the courts of kings. Power, you see, recognizes power. It is the only language it truly speaks. But that terrible eye, so fixated on the thrones and fortresses of the world, passed right over the Shire. It was a green and pleasant blind spot in his all-seeing vision. The thought that his ultimate doom, the unraveling of all his millennia of planning, could possibly originate from a creature more concerned with the timing of his second breakfast than with the conquest of nations was a concept so alien, so utterly absurd, that it could not find purchase in his dark, methodical mind. He was looking for a rival. He never thought to look for a gardener. The hobbits' strength was not in what they could do, but in what they were. They possessed an immunity to the grand temptations that laid low the great. The ring of power promised dominion. It promised the strength to enforce one's will upon the world. To men like Boromir, this was an almost irresistible lure, to use this power for good, to protect his people. To a wizard like Saruman, it was the ultimate tool to create order out of chaos. But to a hobbit, what does the promise of world domination mean to someone whose world is already perfect? A world contained within the borders of a few quiet fields and streams. Their love was not for abstract concepts like power or glory, but for things you could touch and taste and smell. The love of a friend, the taste of a fresh strawberry, the scent of rain on dry earth. It is this rootedness in the simple, good things of life that gave them their extraordinary fortitude. It was a shield of the soul that the great eye could not pierce, a language of the heart it could not comprehend. And my task, as Gandalf, was to recognize that this humble strength, this quiet courage to protect the small and the good, was the one power in all of Middle-earth that Sauron had not accounted for. And in any great conflict, victory is always found in the thing the enemy has overlooked. And so the great tale began, as so many tales do, not with the sounding of trumpets or the clash of armies, but with a quiet knock on a round green door. It began with me, Gandalf, stooping my head to enter the warm, cluttered comfort of Bag End, carrying with me a truth as heavy and as terrible as a mountain. I remember filming those scenes with Elijah, the flickering firelight casting long shadows across the cozy, circular room. The set itself was a masterpiece of detail. Every book, every pipe, every pot of honey speaking to a life of simple pleasures. And in the midst of this gentle haven, I had to introduce a story of pure, unadulterated evil. I had to explain that the charming magic ring his old Uncle Bilbo had left him was, in fact, the One Ring, the vessel of Sauron's very soul, a thing of absolute malice forged in the fires of Mount Doom. I had to tell this gentle homebody that the fate of the world now rested upon his small shoulders. Looking into his eyes, his wide, frightened, innocent eyes, I felt the immensity of the burden I was placing upon him. It felt like a cruelty. I wasn't just asking him to leave his home. I was asking him to leave his very nature, to step out of the quiet pages of a hobbit's life and into the blood-soaked verses of an epic he was never meant to be a part of. And in that moment, he uttered a sentiment that is perhaps the most human and relatable in the entire story. "I wish it need not have happened in my time," he said. And it was my reply that contained the seed of all that was to follow. "So do I." I said, "and so do all who live to see such times." But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. This was the first test, and he passed it, not with a warrior's boast, but with a quiet, terrified acceptance that trembled in his voice. "I will take the ring," he whispered, "though I do not know the way." That single, hesitant decision is the fulcrum upon which the entire Third Age turns. It is a choice born not of ambition or a lust for glory, but of a simple, dutiful sense of what is right. And as the quest unfolds, we see how this profound truth is tested against the anvil of power again and again. The great and the wise, those who should have been the world's champions, are the very ones who are most vulnerable to the ring's temptation. I myself, Gandalf the Grey, a being of angelic power, refused to even touch it. When Frodo offered it to me in his desperation, I recoiled in terror, for I knew that in my hands its power would be magnified. My very desire to wield it for good, to protect the innocent and defeat the darkness, would be the path to my own corruption. Through me, the ring would wield a power too great and terrible to imagine. I would become a dark lord in my own right, and the road to my tyranny would be paved with the best of intentions. Then there was Galadriel, the Lady of Lorien, one of the mightiest and fairest of all the elves left in Middle-earth. When she was offered the ring, she was tempted. We see the storm of it rage within her, the vision of what she could become, a queen, beautiful and terrible as the dawn, treacherous as the sea. All would love her and despair. It was the ultimate test of her long ages of wisdom, and she passed, just barely, choosing to diminish, to fade, to accept the twilight of her people rather than seize a crown of shadow. And then Boromir, son of the steward of Gondor, a man of great valor and deep love for his people. He saw the ring not as an evil to be destroyed, but as a weapon to be used, a gift to turn the tide against the encroaching darkness. He could not understand why they would not wield it, why this small hobbit should be its master. His greatness, his pride, and his desperation became the chinks in his armor through which the ring's poison seeped. leading him to betrayal, and a tragic, albeit noble, end. The ring preys on greatness. It magnifies ambition. It corrupts noble desires. But to a hobbit, its primary promises were mostly meaningless. Its whispers of power fell on the deaf ears of a creature who did not want to rule, but simply to return home. And yet, even for Frodo, the burden was almost unbearable. It was a weight that grew with every league, a coldness that seeped into his very bones, sapping the joy from his memories and casting a pall of grey over the world. It was a spiritual poison, isolating him, breeding suspicion, whispering despair. And here we arrive at Tolkien's masterstroke, the absolute core of our theme. For the smallest person, in the end, cannot change the course of the future alone. The quest would have failed a dozen times over if not for the unwavering presence of another, even smaller, even more overlooked character. I am speaking, of course, of Samwise Gamgee. If Frodo is the archetypal hero, thrust into a role he did not choose, then Sam is something more. He is the embodiment of love in its purest, most stubborn, and most practical form. His quest was not to save the world, it was to save his master. Sauron could never, in a million years of dark calculation, have factored in Sam. He was a gardener, a servant. In the grand scheme, he was less than nothing. Yet this gardener, armed with a length of elven rope and an unshakable loyalty, was the one force the ring could not truly corrupt. His simple, loving heart was a shield that its malice could not easily penetrate. When he briefly bore the ring himself, its temptations were almost comical. It offered him visions of a vast garden, a world of green things under his command. It was a grand vision, but ultimately, all he truly wanted was his own small garden back home in the Shire. His desires were too small, too pure, for the ring to find purchase. Think of that moment on the slopes of Mount Doom, the climax of the entire epic. Frodo has fallen. The ring's weight, the exhaustion, the despair, it has all become too much. He cannot go on. The quest has failed at the final hurdle. Evil has won. And Sam, himself barely able to stand, looks at the master he loves, and he does not offer a grand speech. He offers the purest act of service. I can't carry it for you, he says, his voice choked with tears and effort. But I can carry you. And he does. He lifts his broken master onto his back and takes the final, impossible steps. That is not the strength of a king or a wizard. That is the strength of love. A simple, dogged, gardener's love. And it is that love, the smallest and most potent magic of all, that carries the future on its shoulders. This profound and beautiful principle, this idea that the smallest, most overlooked elements can become the pivotal forces of change, was not a singular thread in Tolkien's grand tapestry. It was the very warp and woof of the whole design. It was a pattern that repeated itself, echoing from the highest councils of the wise to the darkest corners of the wilderness, proving its truth time and time again. The salvation of Middle-earth did not come from a single heroic act, but from a cascade of small, unforeseen consequences. an avalanche of quiet courage set in motion by the most unlikely of individuals. And this brings us to the other two hobbits of the Fellowship, Meriadoc, Brandybuck, and Peregrine. Took Merry and Pippin, when they first tumbled into the quest, it was almost by accident, a consequence of eavesdropping in a cornfield and a fierce, youthful loyalty they did not fully comprehend. In the beginning, they were, if we are being honest, a liability. They were impulsive, prone to foolishness, and possessed a cheerful ignorance of the true gravity of their situation. Pippin's curiosity at the well in Moria awoke the Balrog, a terror from an elder world. Their primary function, it seemed, was to be a source of both comic relief and constant anxiety. When the Fellowship was shattered at the falls of Rauros, and they were captured by a warband of Saruman's Uruk-hai, it felt like a pointless tragedy. Two innocent lives, swept up in a great story that was too big for them, were about to be snuffed out for nothing. Their part in the tale appeared to be over, a sad footnote in the great chronicle of the War of the Ring. But their capture, which seemed a catastrophic failure, became, through the intricate and unpredictable workings of fate, another of those critical turning points. Chained and bound, they were dragged across the wide, windswept plains of Rohan. They were not being taken to their doom, but to their destiny. Their journey ended at the eaves of Fangorn Forest, a dark and ancient place that even the orcs, in their mindless evil, feared and avoided. And in the chaos of a Rohirrim attack, these two small hobbits did the one thing they could do. They escaped. They ran not towards safety, but into the deep primeval gloom of the forest, a place from which legends said no one ever returned. And there they met Treebeard, the Ents, the ancient, slow-moving shepherds of the trees, had long ago withdrawn from the affairs of the wider world. To most, they were a children's story, a forgotten myth. Their sense of time was not measured in years or even lifetimes, but in the slow, patient growth of oak and ash. The frantic wars of men and elves were, to them, a fleeting and noisy distraction in the long, quiet song of the earth. They had resolved not to take a side. It was not their war. Who then could possibly rouse such ancient, slumbering power to action? A great king with a stirring speech of alliances, a wise wizard with warnings of the great danger to all, an eloquent elf lord with songs of the world that was fading. No, it was two lost, frightened, and very small hobbits. They did not win Treebeard over with grand strategy or appeals to a common good. They simply told him their story. They spoke of their journey, of the friends they had lost, and most crucially, they spoke of Saruman. They gave a witness account, not of his grand designs, but of his petty, thoughtless cruelty. They spoke of the wanton destruction, the clear felling of ancient forests, the trees torn down not for need, not for timber, but for the sheer, ugly spite of it, to fuel the fires of his war machines. They were the small voices speaking for the silent, wounded earth, and that simple, honest testimony delivered by these two insignificant seeming creatures, accomplished what no army or king could have done. It woke the forest up. It gave a focus to a slow, ancient, and terrible anger. The decision of the Ents to march on Isengard was an event so utterly outside the realm of Saruman's calculations that he was caught completely unawares. He, the great schemer, the master of plans and prophecies, had fallen into the same trap as his dark master, Sauron. His pride and his focus on the great powers of the world had rendered him blind to the power that lay sleeping at his own doorstep. He never imagined that his fortress, a symbol of his industrial might, would be torn apart not by the armies of men, but by the very trees he had scorned and destroyed. The destruction of Isengard was a devastating blow to the enemy's war effort. It shattered Saruman's power, it broke his army, and it freed the riders of Rohan to ride to the desperate defense of Minas Tirith. It was a victory that tipped the scales of the entire war. And it happened, all of it, because two foolish little hobbits got themselves captured and then ran the wrong way into the right forest. They did not intend to change the world. They were just trying to survive. But in their smallness, in their very helplessness, they became the tiny, unassuming key that unlocked a force of nature. They proved, once again, that the grandest of designs are often at the mercy of the smallest of chances. And yet, this remarkable quality, this unexpected capacity to reshape destiny, is not some magical trait inherent only to the hobbit race. It is a condition of the spirit, a strength that is forged in the crucible of being underestimated. It is the secret power of all those who are marginalized, overlooked, or confined by the expectations of others. It is the courage of those who are defined not by what they are, but by what they are not supposed to be. And nowhere in Tolkien's world is this truth given a more fierce and poignant voice than in the story of Éowyn, the shield maiden of Rohan. She was the White Lady of the Golden Hall, a king's niece, possessed of a spirit as keen and bright as a sword's edge. But she was born a woman in a grim, martial world of men, while her brother, Éomer, could win glory on the battlefield, and her uncle, Théoden, could lead the great charge of the Rohirrim. Her appointed role was to wait, to be a keeper of the hearth, a symbol of the home that the men fought for, a still and silent figure of grace while the world of deeds and valor passed her by. To a spirit like Éowyn's, this was not a role of honor, but a cage. I remember the lines Tolkien wrote for her, the quiet despair that clung to her like a winter mist. A cage to stay behind bars until use and old age accept them, and all chance of doing great deeds is gone beyond recall or desire. It was a prison of duty and custom, and it was slowly extinguishing the fire in her soul. She looked upon Aragorn, the Ranger King, and saw in him not just a man to love, but the embodiment of the freedom she craved, a life of purpose written in the wind and the stars. And when he too rode away to a war from which he might not return, her despair hardened into a steely resolve. In a profound act of defiance against her entire culture, she armed herself in secret, taking the name Dernhelm, and rode to war, hiding her face, hiding her gender, a ghost slipping unnoticed into the ranks of men. She was not part of any grand strategy. She was an anomaly, an unsanctioned warrior, a small person smuggling herself into the great tale, seeking not victory, but a meaningful end. And so she came a secret warrior to the Pelennor fields, to the climactic battle for the fate of Minas Tirith and the world of men. And there, in the midst of the slaughter and the chaos, when all hope seemed to be turning to ash, she witnessed the fall of her king. Théoden was struck down by the Witch King of Angmar, the lord of the Nazgul, Sauron's most terrible servant. He was a creature of ancient dread, a being of pure terror against whom no mortal weapon seemed to bite, a phantom king whose very presence was a poison to the soul. The air crackled with his power and his malice, and he loomed over the fallen king, a shadow of victory, and he uttered his dreadful boast, a prophecy that had protected him for over 1,000 years. No living man may hinder me. It was not a threat. It was a statement of magical fact, a doom laid upon him long ago by the great elf lord Glorfindel. It was his ultimate shield. The greatest champions of Gondor had quailed before it. But Éowyn, filled with a love and grief that had finally found its moment of terrible expression, planted her shield and stood her ground. And in that moment, she did what no man could. She answered him. She pulled off her heavy helmet, letting her long, golden hair stream out in the wind, a banner of defiance against the gloom. "But no living man am I," she cried, her voice ringing clear over the din of battle. "You look upon a woman. Éowyn I am, Eärmund's daughter. You stand between me and my lord and kin. Begone, if you be not deathless. For living or dark undead, I will smite you. If you touch him, in that single, breathtaking instant, she was the unforeseen variable. She was the grammatical loophole in an ancient spell. She was the one thing the prophecy, for all its power, had not accounted for. And with the crucial help of Merry, another small person striking a desperate blow from the shadows, she did what no king or captain of men could have done. She drove her sword into the Witch King's unseen face and destroyed him, shattering his power and breaking the spearhead of Sauron's assault. She did not change the future because she was the strongest warrior, but because of who she was, a woman whose courage the world of men had deemed irrelevant to the battlefield. And so we learn another vital lesson. The course of the future is often changed, not by those who play their appointed roles, but by those who have the courage to defy them. This intricate chain of cause and effect, however, stretches back even further to a single pivotal moment of choice, made long ago in the lonely dark. It goes back to Bilbo Baggins, alone with a magic ring in his pocket, facing a wretched, murderous creature. It goes back to a small, unseen, and world-altering act of pity. Let us travel back in time, away from the clash of armies and the high drama of kings, to a moment of profound quiet and solitude. Let us go down into the utter blackness beneath the misty mountains, where the only sounds are the drip of unseen water and the scuttling of blind things in the cold. It is here we find Bilbo Baggins, not the respectable hobbit of Bag End, but a lost and terrified creature. Far from the sun and the comforts of home, he has just found a ring, a simple band of gold, cool to the touch, and in this lightless world, he has discovered its secret. It makes him invisible. And with this newfound power, he finds himself facing the last obstacle between him and a desperate hope of escape. The creature Gollum, a miserable ancient being, twisted in mind and body by ages of isolation and the corrupting influence of the very ring Bilbo now possesses. Gollum is treacherous, and he is hungry. He blocks the only way out. Every instinct in Bilbo's body, every fiber of his being, must have been screaming at him to act. Here was his chance. He was invisible. He had a small sword, an elvish blade that glowed with a faint light. He could have ended the creature then and there. A swift, silent stroke in the dark. It would have been, by any measure, a justifiable act. Self-preservation, killing a monster to save his own life. No one would have ever known. It would have been a secret buried forever in the heart of the mountain. The world would have moved on, seemingly unchanged. And yet, in that moment of absolute life or death decision, with the power of invisibility at his command, Bilbo did something utterly unexpected. He paused, and in that pause, he saw not a monster, but something pitiable. He saw a lonely, wretched thing, trapped in the same darkness as himself, talking to itself, consumed by the loss of the one thing it had ever loved. It's precious. He felt a surge, not of hatred, but of empathy, a flicker of understanding for its miserable, endless, sunless life. And that single, quiet moment of pity was stronger than his fear. It was stronger than his desire to kill. He made a choice. He chose not to begin his stewardship of the ring with an act of murder. He chose mercy. And instead of striking, he gathered all of his courage, took a deep breath, and leaped. He leaped right over the cowering form of Gollum and fled down the passage towards a sliver of daylight, towards his escape. It was an act of non-violence, an act of restraint that had consequences more vast and far-reaching than any blow he could have struck. Decades later, sitting in the warmth and safety of Bag End, I listened as Frodo, burdened with the knowledge of what the ring truly was, wished aloud that his old uncle had killed Gollum when he had the chance. What a pity that Bilbo did not stab that vile creature when he had a chance. He said, and it was then that I tried to explain to him the deep and mysterious wisdom of that choice. Pity. I replied, it was pity that stayed his hand. Pity. And not to strike without need. It was a lesson that even I, in all my long years, had to learn and relearn. True wisdom is not found in the swift and righteous application of judgment, but in the humble recognition that we cannot see all ends. Many that live deserve death. I told him, and some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them? Then do not be too eager to deal out death in judgment, for even the very wise cannot see all ends. My own heart, a feeling deeper than knowledge, told me that Gollum still had some part to play in the great story, for good or for ill, before the final curtain fell. And so he did. For all the unwavering courage of Frodo Baggins, for all the steadfast, loyal love of Samwise Gamgee, when they finally reached their destination, the fiery cracks of doom in the heart of Mordor. The quest failed. At the very precipice of victory, after all the miles and all the suffering, the ring's power, at the heart of its own domain, was absolute. Frodo, his will finally broken, could not destroy it. He claimed it for his own. In that moment, Sauron saw him. All was lost. Hope was extinguished. And then, out of the shadows, driven by nothing more than his own desperate, slavering need, came Gollum. He was not a hero. He was not there to save the world. He was there for his precious. He attacked Frodo, not as a warrior, but as a desperate addict. And in the ensuing struggle, he bit the ring, and the finger it was on, from Frodo's hand. And then, on the very edge of the abyss, holding his prize aloft, he did a little dance of triumphant, ecstatic glee. And in that dance, he took one step too many. He stumbled, and he fell, clutching his precious into the fires below. He destroyed the ring. The quest was completed not by an act of heroism, but by an act of pathetic, obsessive greed. It was the most improbable of victories, an accident born of addiction and despair. But it was a victory, and it would never have happened, not in 1,000 ages, if a good-hearted hobbit, lost and alone in the dark long ago, had not made a small, quiet choice, the choice of pity, the smallest person making the smallest choice, in a moment no one else would ever see, sealed the fate of the entire world. And that, more than any other lesson, is the truth that echoes from Tolkien's pages into our own lives, that the choices we make in the small, dark places, when no one is watching, may be the very things that define the future. So let us now turn our gaze from the small and the humble, and look for a moment at the other side of this profound equation. For if the central truth of this saga is that the smallest person can change the course of the future, then the corollary, the shadow truth that gives it such sharp relief, is that the greatest and most powerful are often the most tragically blind, the most susceptible to a ruin of their own making. Power, you see, is a treacherous mountain peak. The view from the top is vast, offering a perspective that seems to encompass the entire world. But it is a false perspective. From that great height, the intricate living details of the world below are lost. Forests become mere patches of green. Rivers become silver threads. And people, with all their hopes and fears and small, stubborn loyalties, shrink until they become utterly insignificant, mere ants to be ignored or crushed underfoot. Power breeds a peculiar and fatal form of blindness. Let us consider Saruman the White once more, but in greater depth. He was not born evil. He was, at his beginning, the chief of my own order, the wisest and most esteemed of the Astari, who was sent from the west to aid the peoples of Middle-earth. His knowledge was immense. His voice held the power of enchantment, and his mind was a thing of genius. He was the very embodiment of greatness, and from his unassailable tower of Orthanc, he watched the world, and he grew to despise its messiness, its unpredictability, its reliance on frail things like hope and courage. He saw the rising power of Sauron, a power of will and order and absolute control, and a part of him began to admire it. He looked too long into the Palantir, the Seeing Stone, and Sauron, the master of deceit, showed him visions of unstoppable armies and the inevitable triumph of might. And Saruman's wisdom curdled into cleverness. He came to believe that the complex industrial evil of Mordor could only be countered by a similar but more refined power of his own. His fall was a rejection of the small. He told me himself in that final, terrible confrontation in his garden at Isengard. A new power is rising. He said, against it, the old allies and policies will not avail us at all. He had lost faith in the resilience of men, in the fading light of the elves, in the stubbornness of dwarves, and as for hobbits, they were beneath his contempt, a trivial distraction, the subject of my foolish affections. He gave up on the goodness of the world because it was not efficient. He sought to create a mind of metal and wheels, a system that would work, a power that could dominate. He could no longer see the world as a garden to be tended, but only as a machine to be controlled or a resource to be consumed. And so he was utterly, philosophically incapable of understanding the quest to destroy the ring. The idea of taking the ultimate weapon and choosing to destroy it, rather than wield it, was to him the very pinnacle of idiocy. And that is why he failed. His tower was high, but his vision was narrow. He was so focused on the horizon that he never saw the quiet, green anger growing at his own feet. This blindness of the great is not always born of a lust for power. However, sometimes it is born of its sad twin, despair. And for this, we must look to Denethor, the steward of Gondor. Here was a man of noble lineage, of great intelligence and pride. He was no traitor. He loved his city and his people with a fierce, consuming passion. But he too possessed a Palantir, and he too looked into it, believing in the strength of his own will to resist Sauron. But Sauron did not lie to him. He simply showed him the truth, but a truth carefully curated to breed despair. He showed Denethor the endless legions of Mordor, the black ships of the corsairs sailing up the Anduin, the sheer, overwhelming mathematics of his own strength. He showed Denethor a future in which there was no hope of victory by arms. And Denethor, in his pride, believed only what he could see. His world shrank to the confines of that terrible stone and the hope that existed outside of its frame. He could no longer perceive. When I arrived in Minas Tirith, I found a man already defeated in his heart. When Pippin told him of Frodo's quest, he dismissed it with scorn, folly. He called it, he could not conceive that the fate of his mighty, ancient city, the last bastion of the West, could possibly depend on the wanderings of a hobbit in the wilderness. His gaze was fixed on the great, looming threat of Mordor, and his mind was consumed with grand, tragic strategy. He thought only in terms of battalions and battlements. The idea that salvation could come from a small act of stealth and courage was a fairy tale, an insult to his grim, prideful realism. And so his greatness became his doom. His pride prevented him from listening to counsel. His knowledge led him to despair, and his despair led him to madness, and the funeral pyre, both Saruman and Denethor, two of the great lords of their age, were broken by the same fundamental flaw. They believed in the evidence of power. They trusted in the grand scale, and they could no longer see the transcendent, world-altering power of the very small, the very simple, and the very good. Their tragedy is the ultimate proof that a clear view of the enemy's strength is not wisdom. If it blinds you to the strength of your friends, now, having examined the weakness of the great, let us delve deeper into the corresponding strength of the small. Let us attempt to define the very nature of this particular form of courage. For the courage of a hobbit is a thing distinct and unique, fundamentally different from the valor of a warrior or the fortitude of a king. The courage of the great is so often a public virtue, a performance upon the stage of history. It is the courage of the glorious charge, the defiant last stand, the eloquent speech before battle. It is loud, and it is seen, and it is sung of in the halls of kings. It is no less noble for that, but it is a courage that feeds on hope, on the possibility of victory and glory. But what happens when the songs fall silent, when the banners are torn, and when hope itself seems like a distant, childish memory? It is here, in the cold, grey wasteland of despair, that the courage of the hobbit is found. It is a quiet, internal, and profoundly stubborn courage. It is not the courage to conquer, but the courage to endure. It is the decision made not once on a glorious battlefield, but 1,000 times in the weary soul, to take one more step, and then another, when every fiber of your being is screaming for you to lie down and let the darkness take you. It is the courage of the gardener, not the soldier. A soldier fights to win a battle. A gardener pulls weeds, day after day, not for a single moment of victory, but for the slow, persistent, and often thankless task of tending to life. It is a courage rooted not in the abstract concept of a kingdom or a cause, but in the tangible memory of a specific good. For Frodo and Sam, the good was the Shire. Think of that moment, high on the pass of Cirith Ungol, when the world of Mordor lay before them, a landscape of ash and death under a sky of churning, perpetual twilight. Sam looks out upon this desolation, and for a moment he understands the sheer, impossible scale of their task. And he turns to Frodo and speaks of home. He speaks of the taste of strawberries and cream, of the simple pleasure of walking barefoot in the grass. He remembers the sun, a real sun, and how it felt on his face. This is not a flight of fancy. It is an act of war. He is fighting back against the overwhelming despair of his surroundings by invoking the memory of something small, real and good. There is some good in this world. Mr. Frodo, he says, and it's worth fighting for. He doesn't say the world is worth fighting for. That is too vast, too abstract. He says there is some good in it. It is that focus on the specific, the tangible, the beloved, that gives their courage its unbreakable core. They are not fighting to save the world. They are fighting to save the Shire. And because the Shire is real to them, something they can taste and smell and remember, their resolve becomes a thing of simple brute fact, as real as the rock under their weary feet. This is a form of courage that evil finds almost impossible to comprehend. Sauron understands the lust for power, the fear of death, the desire for glory. He can manipulate these things, use them as weapons. But the love of a hobbit for his garden or for his friend is a language he does not speak. It is a form of power that lies completely outside his sphere of understanding. He can see the Fellowship enter Mordor. He can track their every agonizing step, but he cannot understand why they are doing it. He assumes they have the ring and are coming to challenge him, to usurp his throne. His mind is so consumed with the grammar of power that he cannot conceive of any other motive. The idea that their goal is not to gain power, but to reject and destroy it, is a strategic blind spot so total that it ultimately proves his undoing. This quiet courage of endurance is, I believe, what Tolkien, a veteran of the trenches, saw in the ordinary soldiers around him, not the generals with their grand plans, but the common men, the Tommies, who endured the mud, the fear and the senselessness, not for king and country in the abstract, but for the memory of a pint at the local pub, for the face of a wife or a sweetheart, for the simple, desperate desire to get back home. It is the courage to keep going when all seems lost. It is the strength found not in the muscles, but in the heart's memory. It is the belief, however faint, that the sun will one day shine again. And it will be all the brighter for having been so long absent. And it is this small, persistent, gardener's courage that ultimately proves more resilient than all the steel and fire of Mordor. And just as the smallest person cannot change the future alone, neither can this quiet courage exist in a vacuum. It requires nourishment. It needs a source of strength outside of itself, something to lean on when its own reserves run dry. And in Tolkien's world, that nourishment, that external strength, is given a simple, powerful name: friendship. If the courage of the small is the engine of the quest, then friendship is the fuel that keeps it running. It is the invisible magic, the unspoken force that binds the heroes together and allows them to achieve what no single one of them ever could alone. It is a power that is, once again, almost entirely invisible to the eye of the enemy. The entire quest, from its very inception, is an act of communal faith. The Fellowship of the Ring was not an army. It was a small, disparate group of individuals, bound not by a formal oath of allegiance to a king, but by a personal pledge to a single, vulnerable hobbit, an elf, a dwarf, a wizard, 2 men and 4 hobbits. On the surface, it was a strategic absurdity, a collection of old rivalries and mismatched skills. A dwarf and an elf walking side by side was, in itself, a small miracle. Yet in their shared purpose and the bonds that grew between them, they became something far greater than the sum of their parts. The friendship between Legolas and Gimli, which began in suspicion and grew into a deep, abiding respect and affection, was a symbol of hope for the entire future of Middle-earth, a healing of ancient wounds. But it is in the hobbits themselves that the power of friendship finds its purest and most potent expression. Let us return to Frodo and Sam. for their journey is the absolute heart of this theme. The bond between them is not the grand, poetic friendship of warriors who swear oaths on their swords. It is the quiet, practical, and utterly dependable bond of a master and his gardener. A relationship that deepens and transforms under immense pressure into something akin to brotherhood. Sam's role is not just to protect Frodo's body, but to protect his spirit. He's the keeper of the memory of the Shire. When Frodo's own memories begin to fade, when the ring's poison makes him forget the taste of bread and the sound of laughter, Sam remembers for him. He is the anchor that keeps Frodo tethered to the good. Simple world, they are trying to save. He cooks for him. He carries the gear. He stands watch while Frodo sleeps. These are not grand, heroic deeds. They are small, constant acts of service, of love made manifest in the most practical of ways. And it is this relentless practicality that keeps the quest from dissolving into despair. There is that devastating moment at the stairs of Cirith Ungol, when the ring has so twisted Frodo's mind with suspicion that he sends Sam away. It is, perhaps, the enemy's greatest victory in the entire story. By breaking the friendship, he has broken the quest. Alone, heartbroken Frodo is captured by the orcs, and all is lost. But Sam's love is more stubborn than the ring's malice. His loyalty is not a fragile thing to be broken by a harsh word. It is a deep, abiding current, and though he turns back for a moment in grief, that current pulls him back. He returns, not for glory, not for the quest, but simply because he cannot bear the thought of his master being alone and in pain. And it is his return that saves everything. He faces down the monstrous spider Shelob, a creature of nightmare, not with the strength of a great warrior, but with the desperate fury of a loving heart protecting its own. He takes the ring, bearing its burden to keep it safe, and he orchestrates the rescue of Frodo from the tower. In those dark moments, Sam becomes the hero, but he never sees himself as one. His entire world, his entire motivation, is Frodo. This is the power Sauron can never understand. His world is one of master and slave, of power and fear. The concept of a relationship based on selfless love, of one person willingly carrying another up the slopes of a volcano out of pure devotion, is a strategic calculation he is simply incapable of making. Friendship, in this story, is not a sentiment. It is a force of nature. It is the shield that protects the heart, the light that shines in the darkest of places. It is the final, unanswerable rebuttal to the ring's philosophy of ultimate solitude and domination. And it proves that the smallest person, when bolstered by the love of a friend, possesses a strength that no dark lord can ever hope to break.